Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Live from the Tory party conference in Birmingham, Philip Hammond, he's the new Chancellor. He's going to get to his feet in about half an hour. We'll bring all of that to you live and uninterrupted, but as we build up to it, we bring you two of the best political minds in the business to chew over the news. They've both put large amounts of money in my bank account, for me to say that. The Guardian's political editor, Anushka Asthana, and the Times columnist, Tim Montgomery. Welcome to you both. So, we had the Brexit announcements yesterday. The Prime Minister's hoping that will go away today as they get onto the economy and everything else. We'll come to whether it will or not in a minute. But where are we now? Where are we on the Brexit trail?
Well, Theresa May is a very popular woman with the right of her party, and if you read it today with the Daily Mail, this lady's not for turning, they say.
The Daily May.
The Daily May. They didn't take very long to come to mentioning her steel cap shoes, I noticed.
Ah.
But I have to say, what did she actually say? She said that, you know, immigration is going to be a priority, something that we knew. She said the European Court of Justice will be as well. But beyond that, she did kind of leave herself open, actually. We don't really know what the Brexit deal is going to look like that we'll be pushing for.
But we do know, though they won't say it, or at least I've not been able to get them to say it, we do know when you add up everything that's being said, we will not fall under the jurisdiction of the ECJ. We want a free trade deal. We want the end of free movement. We're out of the single market in the sense of being a member. We'll have access, but it's clear that they know we can't stay in it.
I think that's right, and I think what she is doing is something David Cameron didn't do when he was trying to renegotiate our relationship with the European Union. He never went to the table with his European counterparts and said, if you don't give me a good deal, I'm prepared to say to the British people we should leave. What Mrs May is saying to European counterparts is, we're going. If you don't give me anything, we're still going. You know, Britain is leaving the European Union because I'm going to deliver on my promise to control our borders. What I think she hopes European leaders will give her in response to that is a better deal than perhaps some of the critics think at the moment.
She's going to ask for the moon to begin with. That's a negotiating tie. She's actually, I think, will still ask to be in the single market, despite not meeting any of its criteria. She'll get knocked back a bit, but it starts it on her ground. Is there any concern when it comes to putting this repeal of the European Communities Act through Parliament, that she'll be in some trouble?
I don't think that MPs in Parliament will vote against the idea of repealing the European Communities Act itself because, look, everybody knows there's been a referendum. Everybody knows what the outcome was. I don't think MPs will be churlish enough to say we're going to vote against that as an idea. But what this allows people to do is perhaps to amend the legislation as it goes through Parliament and perhaps to, you know, try and cause a little bit of trouble on the way through.
The key thing, though, is this vote will only happen after Article 50 has been triggered. So Britain will be already on the conveyor belt. In the legal process to leave the EU will be underway. So Parliament won't, in that vote, be able to stop Brexit from happening. They'll just be able to potentially amend its character.
And very strong language from Theresa May on MPs not having a vote on triggering Article 50, which has annoyed some on her own backbenches, to be honest.
What about the Lords? 6-1 in favour of Remain, I'm told.
Well, yeah, I mean, Parliament is not a place that is enthusiastic about Brexit.
Yeah, and which is why I don't quite buy the idea that an early election is off the agenda.
No,
there are plenty of pretexts. If her agenda is being frustrated by anyone, backbenchers, Labour opposition, or the Lords, I think you're quite right to highlight them, she can go to an election and say, I want a mandate to deliver my social and Brexit agenda.
Bugging up on 1909. Our viewers will know what I'm talking about. And lots of peers, Campbell Bannerman and so on. Of course, the government now hopes, Mrs May in particular, that we'll stop talking about Brexit for this conference and move on to the economy. So the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has said that he's going to ease off deficit reduction. We don't yet know by how much. But what does the conference think about that? The people here, are they happy to see this change in borrowing? We sent our Adam with his balls, which he takes everywhere, to find out.
When George Osborne was Chancellor, he was all about driving down the deficit and even getting the public finances into surplus. Philip Hammond seems less bothered. But what about people here at the conference? Do they want to ease off on deficit reduction or crack on? David, hang up the phone and do the mood box. One of the Brexit ministers.
Okay, I'll probably go for ease off, given that we've gone Brexit. Before that, crack on.
Okay, ease off because of Brexit.
Definitely.
If you look back at George Osborne's history, I think he did a good job, but you know, many people look at him and think that, well, they don't like him.
Right.
People
do you think what is he? Was he like a bit obsessed about cuts? Do you think?
Well, maybe. But
I'm just going to stop you there. Andrea, would you like to do the Daily Politics balls? Your first go at the Daily Politics balls, as in the cabinet. No? Is that you politely dismissing my balls?
Absolutely crack on.
Yeah, more cuts.
Well,
have we not gone far enough?
We've got to reduce the deficit. You know, you can't run a country on a deficit budget.
We've started and we need to finish what we started. So.
That's a very thick book. What have you got there?
Call Me Dave by Lord Ashcroft.
Oh, I suppose you're allowed to read that now. He's gone.
Yes,
I think it was. You weren't allowed to read that last year.
It was on sale.
Thank you very much. Crack on. Do you think there's more that can be cut from the public finances?
Yes.
Such as?
Some areas of the health service.
You want to cut the NHS?
No, some areas.
Right.
I meant like the administrators.
Who would you rather have a drink with, George Osborne or Philip Hammond?
Well, I think George may have the edge, I guess. Maybe.
Better banter.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you think we should have a surplus by 2020?
Hopefully, if we can, I would say so, yes, definitely.
So don't abandon that target.
Don't abandon the target, make sure it keeps going.
Guys, why are you watching Boris's speech when you could be doing the Daily Politics balls? Deficit reduction, ease off or crack on?
Crack on.
Yes, crack on. Are ministers allowed to do this without prime ministerial authorisation?
Well, of course. What is ease off or crack on? What does that mean?
Deficit reduction.
Oh, well, we said that we're going to get rid of the deficit. We're just not going to do surplus.
I've been waiting to do this all year.
Well, it's Christmas. Here you go. Get a ball.
Fantastic.
Deficit reduction. Ease off or crack on?
Fantastic. Crack on.
Ease off.
Ease off.
I think it's time to ease off on the austerity, to be honest with you. We've got more important things on the table.
Deficit reduction. Crack on or ease off?
Crack on.
Crack on?
Yeah.
When do you want it gone by?
As soon as possible.
Well, Philip Hammond, I hope you're watching because your party faithful have issued your instructions when it comes to the deficit, slightly unscientifically. Loads of them want you to crack on with getting it down.
Well, there we go. And we do need to do our research because the famous 1909 People's Budget, which led to a huge standoff with the House of Lords and the creation of hundreds of new peers, it wasn't Campbell Bannerman because he died in 1905, so it'd be difficult for him. It was, of course, Asquith, who was by then the Liberal leader, though Bannerman had set some of these social changes in place. There we go. You can't beat research. What was Asquith's famous words? Keep your eye on Paisley. That's the way the country will go. Not sure you can say that now.
No.
Mr. Hammond's got a difficult juggling act here. He's got to do a change in direction in some way, but he's got to give convincing reasons. And it can't be that much of a change of direction given all the pain of 6 years of budget reduction.
I would have found it difficult to know which of ball to put in those boxes, because I think we need to crack on with deficit reduction. We're still spending too much on day-to-day expenses, what the economists call current expenditure. But I would definitely ease off on squeezing on capital spending. With global borrowing rates so low, it makes sense, I think, to borrow long-term to improve our roads and railways
But the current
and
trajectory
housing
of capital
stock.
spending is down.
Exactly, and so George Osborne kept wearing his hard helmets and his high-vis jackets, but actually he cut capital spending. We weren't investing for the long term, so I think it's very important that we change. In the post-Brexit world, many people on the left feared that we become kind of the sweatshop of Europe. Workers' rights would be thrown out of the window and we become sort of a highly deregulated, low tax, no rights workforce. I think what we're seeing from Theresa May and Phil Hammond is a different vision of Britain.
To each other.
High infrastructure, high skills, high investment. I sort of wrote in the Times today, almost as though at the time we're leaving the European Union, we're becoming more European, more Christian democratic in actually how we construct our economic policy.
Now, My memory failed me over Campbell Bannerman and then Asquith, but has it failed me? Didn't Ed Balls want to borrow to invest?
Oh, quite similarly to John McDonnell. There's been a
He
bit of
wanted-
continuation.
John McDonnell's in a
He
different...
wanted to borrow for everything, not just for investment.
That's in
the
a different
difference.
category
But,
altogether.
you know, we're talking about politicians wanting to have their cake and eat it. I think if you'd had Philip Hammond on your video, he would have actually taken two balls and put them in both holes, because the truth is, what he's going to say today is that on the one hand, we want to ease off, no more targets, he's a different man to George Osborne, but on the other hand, we're going to crack on with fiscal consolidation. And I think this is really about messaging to some extent. Philip Hammond is not a man who thought that targets were a good idea, and I think we'll see a real change of tone from George Osborne's days.
Okay, we see, not long to wait. Thank you both for being with me this morning. So the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, will be getting to his feet in the conference hall to deliver his set-piece speech in around 15 minutes' time or so. So what do we know that he's likely to say? There's been a little overnight briefing. Mr. Hammond, who as Foreign Secretary was in favour of Remain, warned this morning of an economic roller coaster as Britain negotiates its exit from the European Union. He insisted the UK economy, though, is very strong going into this period. But there is a need, he then went on to say, to be realistic and have a realistic expectation of the turbulence once Article 50 is triggered. Theresa May, of course, said that that's going to happen by the end of March next year. In his speech today, the Chancellor will confirm that the government is abandoning his predecessor George Osborne's fiscal target to get the UK budget into surplus by 2020, and that his new fiscal framework will be set out in the autumn statement, that's on the 23rd of November, taking into account the new circumstances that Britain faces. Mr. Hammond will also launch a £3 billion home building fund for England to build 25,000 extra homes over the next 4 years, and a further 200,000 homes, but that's in the long term. The plan also includes a borrowing of up to about, we're not quite sure, maybe about 3 billion or more, signal for the government to allow greater borrowing to boost the economy. Now, if needed during these 2 years to 2019, the UK will have to reach a trade deal, of course, with the EU at the same time. I'm joined now by the Minister for Digital Policy, ally of the former Chancellor, George Osborne, Matt Hancock. Welcome back to the programme. So, why is he abandoning George Osborne's targets?
Well, clearly things have changed and the economy's changed, and there was a vote for Brexit, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable response to that.
But your old mentor, Mr. Orban, said if we voted for Brexit, there would have to be a punishment budget. What happened to that?
Well, circumstances have changed, and we've seen what's happened in the economy over the summer. And I think the appropriate response, we've seen the response in monetary policy, cutting interest rates, and clearly, given that there's uncertainty, there's challenges, it's more difficult to get to that point.
So the punishment budget threat was wrong?
Well, I don't think it's worth going through the referendum.
Oh, I think it is, because you said all manner of things would happen, and we voted to leave, and you told us we'd have a punishment budget if we left. We haven't had a punishment budget. If anything, the fiscal targets are going to be loosened. So the punishment budget was just plain Project Fear wrong.
Well, I don't think it's worth going through that. What matters is how we respond to policy now and set up policy.
But if what you told us in the past is unreliable, then it colours how we look at you, what you tell us now. So I think it would only be fair to the viewers and to voters to admit that the punishment budget was a huge mistake and is unnecessary, even though we voted to leave.
Well, what the Chancellor is to set out, and what we've heard about this morning, and he was talking about this morning, is how you respond to the circumstances now, and things have changed. And, you know, on this point, there's an important question of how the economy responds given Brexit, and there are some signs that hasn't been as bad as the independent forecasters predicted. I think that's good news.
Right. But what's changed? You say that the fiscal targets are being changed because the economy's changed. In what way has the economy changed in the 100 days since we voted to leave? As I look, all the forecasts are going back to where they were before June the 23rd. So what's changed?
Well, some of them have come off. There has been a rebound after that. I think that's good. The jobs numbers have been good. But if you look at, for instance, the the services sector
rose in July.
It fell very sharply in July,
and
then it rose again
back in August.
Now, so you've got to look at what's actually happening in the economy, and then you've got to set fiscal policy according to that.
But before the referendum, the consensus forecast was that the economy would grow by around 2% this year. 100 days into the Brexit process, the consensus forecast is back at 2%. So I ask you, on the broad macroeconomic figures, what has changed to justify a change in the targets?
Well, the forecasts for next year are lower than they were before the vote. That is a change. And if you think about it, you've got to set fiscal policy according to what is expected to happen. So we'll receive the forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility ahead of the autumn statement, and that's what you've got to use as the basis. Look, when circumstances change in economics, you then have to set your policy according to your best assessment of the circumstances.
But the people making the forecast that the economy will slow next year are the same people that made the forecast that it would slow in the immediate aftermath of June the 23rd. They were wrong.
Well, according to the figures and according to the surveys, there was a big dip in July. Now, there has been a rebound, but I think that's good news, and now we've got to assess things according to where we are.
If you start to reassess all these deficit figures, doesn't that mean that all that 6 years of relentless emphasis on deficit reduction, in the end, you were inflicting pain on the British people that wasn't necessary?
No, I think that's completely wrong. And the reason it's wrong is that the deficit is down by 2/3 already. It was at a historic high, wholly unsustainable. It's still unsustainably high now. It still needs to come down. But we've always said that the pace at which you bring that down it should be set by economic circumstances and what is possible. And the new Chancellor is making an assessment on the new economic figures, given the new facts, and then we'll set that out.
So the deficit will continue to come down?
I certainly hope so.
Well, where else are you going to cut if you're going to increase spending on infrastructure investment?
Well, the deficit was already projected to fall because it's been coming down from over 10% of GDP. It's come down by 2/3. It was projected to go down further than that. I'm sure we'll get the full figures in the autumn statement, but what the Chancellor was saying today is that the pre-Brexit proposal to be able to reach surplus by 2020 is not going to be possible. But he's also, I mean, if you saw him this morning, he's also very clear that the deficit needs to come down.
But he's also going to spend more. You thought you had to get the deficit down because if you didn't, you would pay a penalty in the bond markets. But it turns out in this strange age of QE and deflationary times in the global economy, you don't pay a penalty.
Well, I'd put that the other way around. Because we have the clear commitment, the political will, and the determination to get it down, that's why those bond rates, is one of the reasons those bond rates have remained low.
But countries with far worse fiscal positions than us, far bigger percentage of their GDP to national debt, they're borrowing just as cheaply as we are.
But there were hardly any countries that had far worse fiscal positions than us at the start of this process.
Italy, whose national debt is 135% of GDP, they borrow just a little bit more expensively than us. There has been no penalty for those who've run more expansionary fiscal policies.
But that's not true. So Italy's deficit was smaller than ours at the start of the process. It's now bigger than ours because we've had this determination to get the deficit down.
And it still borrows cheaply.
No, it went. We had a whole series, several years in which it had a potential crisis in its borrowing rates when the costs of its borrowing were much higher. Because higher than ours, because we've got a plan, and they didn't.
But the fact is, you're now telling us that we will be able to borrow more than planned, to borrow to invest, and we won't pay a penalty in the bond markets, that we can still borrow just as cheaply as we have, correct?
I think that
is that right?
That's not exactly how I'd put it. How I'd put it is that you've got to have a sustainable fiscal position, and it was wholly unsustainable. The current level is still sustainable, and it still needs to come down.
What's the difference between what you're talking about now and what Ed Balls campaigned on in 2015? He wanted to borrow a bit more to invest. That's what you're going to do.
Well, there's a difference of there's a difference in two important ways. One is of scale, and we haven't heard the full details from the Chancellor yet. I'm sure we'll be cutting to him in a minute. But the second is of determination. We have proved over and over again that we're willing to take the decisions that are necessary to make sure that we have sustainable public finances. You know, we've discussed this many times. I'm absolutely clear in our determination to have sustainable public finances.
So this is Ed Ball's light, isn't it?
No, I don't
It's
think
Ed Ball's
so.
light. You're going to borrow, he was going to borrow, you may just borrow not quite as much. But it's the same principle that you denied that you could do that in the election campaign. You told us we can't borrow more to invest.
No, the distinction is that we've got the political will and the plan to bring the deficit down.
The Ed Ball's plan?
No, the plan, according to Labour, was not to get there at all.
£3 billion for new home building. How much of that's new money?
Well, you'll see where the money comes from set out in detail in the autumn statement. But this is money that wasn't in the budget for house building before. So if that's what you mean,
$2 billion is being borrowed.
Well, ultimately,
which you told us you couldn't do. You're not borrowing to build.
No, this is about getting money into house building.
Yeah, by borrowing.
Which one of the most important things that we can do is get house building
We
going.
know that, so why didn't you do it before?
Well, we had a whole series of different policies in this area.
None of which have worked.
And now we're going to take a slightly different approach, which is using the public sector land that we've got and making sure we get
and using the public sector balance sheet to borrow, to put in. When you take all these measures together, I mean, I've seen figures that it may be worth $5 billion. How many new homes a year will this produce?
Well, the aim of these packages specifically is to get just over 200,000 new homes.
Per year?
And we've also got to make sure that at the same time the private sector house building gets going faster than it has been.
But this will be private sector housing to be built in this, won't it?
Well, part of it is on public sector land and using the budget, the public balance sheet, as you said, and part of, but also house building on private balance sheets by private land builders is incredibly important.
So 200,000 houses a year.
It's just over in total.
That's what David Cameron pledged when he became Prime Minister. What did he achieve?
In terms of starts, the starts have got up to...
In terms of completions. What's the average completion rate under the Cameron years?
Why don't you tell me?
123,000.
Yes. Is that the average? Do you say that's the average over the 6 years?
Over the 6 years.
Yeah. Well, it was
so nowhere near 200,000.
No, it was incredibly difficult at first because we were still in the throes of the Great Recession. Actually, that figure came up, and the fact that, of course, the starts figure improves before the completions figure by its nature, and that figure had got up to pre-crash levels.
Well, actually, it hasn't. After 6 years of Conservative government, how many houses did we complete in the last fiscal year?
I haven't got that figure in my head.
145,000.
Right.
So you're still way behind.
But that's above the average.
Way behind. Still the lowest completion figures since the 1920s.
That's not actually right. Because what you've got to look at is how fast we've managed to get the starts in housing going, because that will foreshadow completions in 9 months, a year when those houses get done. Now, but the starts in the year to June 2016 were 144,000, which is actually lower than the 145,000 you managed to complete the previous year. So the starts are not exactly soaring up. So what we should do is have an injection of more support to get more house building and to bring more house builders on instead of just the big ones that we've got at the moment.
I've got that. I understand that.
Yeah.
But we've had Gordon Brown made the same promises. Tony Blair made them. We're going to get 200,000 houses a year. I mean, the Blair-Brown averages are better than yours, but they're not great. Brown was 136,000 completions. Blair was 148,000 completions. No one, politicians again and again tell me we'll get to 200,000. We never get it. We still get these incredibly historic low completions. And I don't understand why what's being announced today is really going to make any difference to that.
What I don't understand is this argument that because it's difficult, we shouldn't try. And of course we should. And making sure that we get that level of house building up is important. There's a huge amount of work that's gone into it. And this is a slightly different approach, because all of that approach that you've talked about in the past was all based on trying to incentivise on the private side and then some local authority and housing association building. This is using the central government balance sheet in a new way.
You're going to build a lot of new council houses?
We've built far more than happened under
but
the
it's still
Labour regime.
Still, they didn't build any, so it was hard to beat. Are you going to build a lot of new council houses?
Well, there's a combination of council houses, yes, also housing association, social housing, and then houses, private sector houses for people to buy.
It's good to have you back on. We've run out of time. When do you think you'll return to frontline politics?
Who?
You.
I'm having a whale of a time.
That's different from frontline politics.
I mean, I'm on the daily politics, Andrew. What more?
You're always on the daily politics. You're always on that. And I was delighted to see you again. Thank you, Matt Hancock, who is the Minister for Digital Policy these days, whatever that means. Anyway, shall we have a look in the hall and see what's going on? The Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, is making his speech. We interviewed him yesterday on the Sunday Politics. He's reconfirmed the government's commitment to HS2, and given that we're in Birmingham, he's pledged £12 billion towards the transport component of the so-called Midlands engine. 12 billion. Where does that come from? Oh, the North is the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands now has the Midlands engine. We'll just have to see what Lincolnshire gets next, or Cumberland. We shall see. Anyway, we're joined by Laura Kunsberg, BBC political editor, Paul Johnson of the IFS. Welcome to you both. I don't know if you heard my interview with Matt Hancock there, but how much of this change in deficit reduction targeting casts a shadow over all the previous emphasis on deficit reduction?
Well, things have genuinely changed, and of course the deficit has come down by an awful lot. It was over £150 billion, it's around £70 billion now.
So well, by their original plan it was meant to have gone by now altogether.
And that was down to the economy not going anywhere near as well as hoped. What's happening now is that we've got an enormous amount of uncertainty about what's going to happen to the economy over the next 3 or 4 years, but actually next 10 or 20 years. So to say that you're going to have a very specific target for 3 or 4 years hence, given that uncertainty, I think it's quite appropriate to move away from that, as indeed George Osborne said that he would do. But I'm sure we're still going to get some focus on concerns about the total level of deficit and debt. Exactly how that's couched, we remain to see.
I've just been told that the amount of money for the Midlands engine is 12 million. Not 12 billion.
That's quite a big difference.
I'm sorry to have raised the hopes of the beautiful city of Birmingham there. 12 million, I guess that's just to kickstart it. They probably had a heart attack in Manchester if they heard 12 billion. Mr. Hammond has a difficult balancing act, I would suggest, Laura, on two fronts today. He has to make a change in policy, a change in emphasis on fiscal stance from his predecessor. But at the same time, he can't tell, so that's one thing. Yeah. The other thing is that he can't really tell us what he has in store until the autumn statement on November the 23rd.
Absolutely, and he's constricted in that sense on both sides. And I think even in his very nature as well, he's a very different kind of politician. You know, over the years, we've got used to the Chancellor's speech being a huge event. The Chancellor had his own hat stuffed full of his own rabbits. He tended to revealing things with a flourish towards the end of the speech. Gordon Brown did that too, and in a sense George Osborne carried on that tradition of the Chancellor having just as big a day almost as the Prime Minister, the leader's speech. But Philip Hammond is just not that kind of politician. He's just not that character. Now it's partly because he has to keep his goodies for the November statement. The data about the post-referendum world is only just starting to trickle in, so they're not sure what position they're going to be in by the end of November. But it's also just a measure of the fact this is a different government. He's a different kind of politician, Theresa May is a different kind of politician, Flash is out, if you like.
Right.
But Philip Hammond is nonetheless very determined, as we've seen from this morning, to basically sketch out a different path. Targets are out, frameworks are in, and politically, maybe not practically, politically, that is very different.
Infrastructure spending is the buzzword on the left, the right, the centre. Everybody's in favour. It's the new motherhood and apple pie. Can I suggest that whereas infrastructure spending can improve the long-term supply-side performance of the economy, in terms of Keynesian pump priming, it actually doesn't have very much of a speedy impact?
That's broadly right, and the important thing about this infrastructure and indeed about improving the long-term performance of the economy is it is a long-term thing. Governments actually can have a big effect on our productivity and living standards, but not next year, maybe in 5 years, more likely in 10 years, because these things do take a while. In terms of pump priming, the trouble with these infrastructure projects is they tend to take a long time to happen. Actually, if you look back under the last Labour government, year after year, they were missing by billions the amount that they were hoping to spend on infrastructure. They just couldn't get the money out of the door. And of course, actually, we don't know, even if you wanted to pump prime, we don't actually know whether it's the next couple of years you want to pump prime because there's going to be an economic problem, or whether it's a much longer term thing as we finally actually come out of the European Union.
Laura, just before we come to you, let's see some pictures. I think Mrs May has been out this morning in the Birmingham area at a building site. Politicians have a special like of building sites. There are plenty of building sites here in Birmingham as the whole city goes through a massive renovation program, modernised program there with the Chancellor, not wearing high-vis. Unlike the previous Chancellor, clearly high-vis is out now when you visit these building sites, and there she is being told. I'm told this is HSBC new Midlands headquarters that is being built, the big bank coming here to the Midlands. Laura, you were going to say something about this infrastructure business.
Well, one of the interesting things is, in the housing speech from Sajid Javid, and what will be underlined by Philip Hammond, I believe, today, is something broader that's going on, is that ministers and Number 10 are on the hunt for policies that will be able to show a difference before the next general election. So just to pick up on Paul's point, you're right, infrastructure promises have sort of been scattered around like confetti in the past few years. Everybody thinks it's a good idea. Who doesn't think we should be investing in the future of the country? The political problem has often been, it takes years to get these things through, years to make a tangible difference in terms of jobs, years to make a tangible difference in terms of voters' lives. And there is ministers I've been talking to in the last couple of weeks, a sense they're also looking not just for the right thing to do, but for things they believe they can show progress on before the next general election. That's what's behind some of the announcements that Sajid Javid has been making about housing, accelerated construction, the description of one of his programmes. They want to be able to do things that they can show progress on. Not easy.
Mr. Obama used to call them shovel-ready jobs.
Sure.
And then he had trouble identifying very many shovel-ready jobs in an age of planning restrictions and controls. That's been the difficulty of these things. But the one thing is, we may have to get into law just a minute. The Chancellor's being introduced, so I may interrupt you. The one thing is, it does seem now you can widen the deficit. You can allow for much slower deficit reduction, and you pay no penalty in the bond markets, which we'd never have thought 10 years ago.
Well, in large degree, that's a reflection of the weakness of the world economy. People are looking for what they consider to be, are desperately looking for what they consider to be relatively safe assets.
So sovereign bonds of countries like ours.
Debt, including our sovereign debt, despite the relatively high level of deficit and debt, still looks very, very safe relative to the uncertainties that surround the rest of the UK economy and the international economy.
But in terms of the change to go for investment in order to be able to spend cash, which is a change with the previous administration, even though there were hints from George Osborne he might be going to go down this path. You know, Philip Hammond and Theresa May have not sort of woken up in the last couple of weeks thinking, jolly good, we're now going to be full throttle Keynesians. You know, they're not huge converts to massive borrowing to get massive projects. These amounts, as I understand it, will be relatively small, 2 billion borrowing for housing, maybe equivalent kinds of amounts for some infrastructure projects. So yes, it is a change, but it is not a sort of 180-degree flip for them to suddenly be pursuing a completely different economic philosophy.
You can understand the emphasis on housing because if you can get the planning permissions, that can happen quickly. You employ a lot of people, we're short of houses, people go into new houses, they go and buy new kitchens, new bedrooms. You can see the Keynesian multiplier effect on that. To do it, and it's what helped the 1930s in this country. The recovery was huge there. The problem is getting the planning permission.
Yeah, planning permission has always been a problem. It seems to be easing up a little, but only a little at the moment. No government has come anywhere near meeting the targets that they've set themselves. So there are constraints on this, but yes, you can probably build housing more quickly than you can build a big new road or an enormous new
rail high-speed railway
link or anything like that. So you have those effects relatively fast
but
if you can get them out the door.
It has a political problem for this party too, because the demand for more new homes is greatest in the Tory home county shires.
Indeed. And interesting that the new Community Secretary Sajid Javid was addressing a meeting of Tory councillors last night, perhaps not quite reading them the Riot Act, but certainly I think he's pretty determined to say to their foot soldiers, their activists around the country, if we believe as a party that we've got to get more homes built, which Theresa May cares about, he cares about, the Cabinet cares about, that means also you guys have to stop being quite as controlling, quite as protective of the parts of the country that you represent. But you know, we've heard this from politicians before, many times. You lose count of the number of times that this is said, but I suspect also later in the year there may well be more legislation, maybe another housing white paper that will go further in easing up the planning restrictions. I think, as Paul suggested, there has been a little bit of change on this in the last couple of years, but not anything like enough, most people believe, if the government's to get to its target of building
Which
a million
is still,
homes
as I was
by
going through with Matt
2020.
Hancock, way behind the £200,000 target. This must be the longest introduction of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in living memory. The MP introducing him is still talking. Would it matter if in the autumn statement he actually doesn't set a date for a surplus? Would anybody care? Is it not more important for the markets that they just see that at some stage the deficit gets smaller and smaller, that the surplus was a kind of Osborne conceit?
I think you're exactly right. In fact, given the level of uncertainty about where the economy is going, I think it would be a mistake actually to say we will get to surplus in 2020 or 2023 or whatever. What he can do is set out a path. He can set out an ambition. He could even say that we will, as George Osborne did actually back in 2010 and 2011, we will aim always in 4 or 5 years' time to be getting to surplus, but if the economy changes, we'll adjust what we're trying to achieve and push it further out.
Is the Prime Minister going to get her way? Do they stop talking about Brexit today? Do they start talking about the economy? Or can they just not help themselves?
Well, it will be interesting to see if Philip Hammond even really addresses it in any kind of detail. I don't think that he will, and it is overshadowing everything at this conference, there's no question. Now, it was a cute political ploy for Theresa May to give a speech yesterday. A long time since a Tory leader has done that on the first day of conference. In fact, I think we've got to go back in the history books to see when the leader was going to speak twice. Very clearly, her goal was to get that out of the way. But look, it's still what all the chat is in the bars, all the chat at fringe meetings. People are today, for example, saying, did she really mean it yesterday when she suggested there would be some kind of hard Brexit? The one thing I would say on that is party leaders always say what they need to at that moment.
Of course they do. Well, at last, here we go, into the conference hall here in Birmingham for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, to give his first address to the Tory party faithful at the annual conference in his new position as Chancellor. Here is Philip Hammond.
2015 intake. Amanda, you held off a ferocious pincer movement in Cannock Chase by Labour from one side and UKIP from the other, and your result was one of the highlights of that night last May, and we congratulate you on a fantastic achievement. It's great to be back here in Birmingham and a privilege to address this conference as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets in admitting that I just might have hoped to have been a Treasury Minister a little bit earlier in my political career. In fact, having been Shadow Chief Secretary for 3 years, up to the 2010 general election, I rather suspect that that infamous note by Liam Byrne, you remember the one, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid there is no money," I rather suspect that note was intended for me. But it went to David Laws, who published it, although I read he's now trying to get it back. And of course, it became what may be the shortest political suicide note in history. Liam, your message to your successor was an admission of Labour's abject failure. I'll let you into a secret. My predecessor didn't leave me a note. But if he had, here's what it would have said. Dear Chancellor, employment is up. Wages are rising. The deficit is down and income tax has been cut for tens of millions of people. That is the Conservative record. That's the difference a Conservative leader makes. Anyway, I got to the Treasury in the end. And I'm delighted to have such an excellent team supporting me. David Gauke as Chief Secretary, Jane Ellison as Financial Secretary, Simon Kirby as Economic Secretary, all of them ably supported by our Commons Whip, Steve Barclay, and our PPSs, John Glenn and Craig Williams. So please give them a big round of applause. Actually, I even went down to the Bank of England last week to check on the gold reserves, what's left of them. Because you remember Gordon Brown sold half of them off at the bottom of the market, losing British taxpayers a staggering £7 billion in the process. Another example of Labour's failure. We last met in this hall 2 years ago on the eve of the fight of our political lives. A fight between two very different visions of the future. Our Conservative vision of a Britain moving forward with a strong economy, supporting strong public services, and Labour's offer of a Britain going back to the bad old days of tax, spend and waste. And it's a credit to your hard work and the good sense of the British people that we won that fight. And we should not forget the debt that this party owes to the man who led us out of opposition and into coalition and then on to form the first Conservative government in 18 years, our former leader and Prime Minister, David Cameron. But today, my friends, we meet on the eve of a different challenge, no less daunting, no less crucial to the future of our country. That vote on 23rd of June, the first of its kind anywhere in Europe, was a defining moment, not just of this Parliament, but of this generation. The moment when the British people decided to change direction and map out a new path for our country's future. And whichever side of the argument we were on, we shouldn't forget this. Only one mainstream political party was prepared to give the British people their say. Only one party delivered that referendum, and only one party unhesitatingly accepted the result. This great party, the Conservative Party. That result in June gave clear voice to a desire by the British people for an end to political union and a restoration of control. Control, that key word. Control over the rules and regulations that govern their lives. Control over who can live and work in their country. And control over how their money is spent. And I can reassure the British people of this. That message has been received loud and clear. No ifs, no buts, no second referendums. We are leaving the European Union. But it is equally clear to me that the British people did not vote on June 23rd to become poorer or less secure. So our task is clear. Repatriate our sovereignty, control our borders, and seize the opportunities that the wider world has to offer, but do all of this while protecting our economy, our jobs, and our living standards. Now, the message may be simple, but I can assure you the process will be complex. Successful negotiation with the EU 27 will demand patience, experience, meticulous planning, and steely resolution. And I know of no one better equipped to guide us through these negotiations than our brilliant new Prime Minister, Theresa May. We should approach these negotiations with self-confidence. Our economy is the 5th largest in the world. Our nation is built upon a history of global trade. Our people are responsible for some of the most significant inventions and discoveries of history. So no one should be in any doubt that we have the skills, the ingenuity, and the determination to make a success of Brexit. Starting from a position of strength, and thanks in no small part to the actions of my predecessor, we enter these negotiations with an economy that is fundamentally robust. It's easy to forget, 6 years on, the scale of the legacy of Labour's Great Recession that we inherited in 2010. Turmoil in the markets, a banking system still reeling from the crisis, a deficit of more than 10% of GDP, the highest in our peacetime history, an economy on the brink. And it was the decisions that George Osborne took in those early days that pulled us back from the precipice and set us on a course to recovery. The tough early choices. Those tough early choices and the doggedness in sticking with them delivered that intangible but indispensable commodity, credibility. Credibility in the markets that helped secure record low borrowing costs, and credibility with business, securing the investment that supported our recovery. And the results are clear for all of us to see. 2.7 million people more in work today under a Conservative government than in 2010 under Labour. Did we hear that achievement being lauded in Liverpool last week? Of course not, because Corbyn's Labour Party has abandoned the agenda of working people, deserting the middle ground of British politics in favour of the socialist ideology of the metropolitan left-wing elite, leaving us, the Conservatives, as the true party of British working people. Of course, for much of his time as Chancellor, George Osborne faced Ed Balls across the dispatch box. Remember Ed Balls? Yeah, I know you remember him from Saturday night. I'm asking if you remember him in his more minor role as Shadow Chancellor. By the way, you know Ed wasn't their first choice for Strictly. They were going to ask Corbyn to do it, but then someone told him that he had 2 left feet. I watched Ed on Saturday night, and I don't want to sound like Craig Revel Horde, but I have to say I think his Charleston is probably better than his economic analysis. Because he told us back then that our policies would push the economy into recession. But he was wrong. Since 2010, Britain has grown faster than any other economy in the G7. He said we would never replace lost public sector jobs with new private sector jobs. But we did. Not 1 for 1, but 7 for 1. And that's not all. We got our deficit down by nearly 2/3. We cut the welfare bill. We've kept mortgage rates low, protecting millions of homeowners through difficult times. We've cut income tax for 30 million people and taken 4 million low-paid workers out of income tax altogether. I say, not bad for an economy that looked out for the count when we took it over in 2010, and a record of which this party can be justly proud. But we cannot rest on our laurels. We must look to the future. to the economic challenges ahead. Let's start with the immediate challenge. The markets have calmed since the referendum vote, and many of the recent data have been better than expected. That is the clearest demonstration of the underlying strength of our economy. But there is no room for complacency. Many businesses which trade with the EU are uncertain about what lies ahead. They have understandable questions about the process of the negotiations, about the deal that will be done, about the changes they will have to make to adapt to the post-Brexit world, and about what it will all mean for their employees, their company, their business model. And I understand their concerns. Business, after all, hates uncertainty. But let me repeat the pledge of the Prime Minister yesterday. As we negotiate our exit from the EU and our future relationship with it, this government will fight for the best possible deal for British business and British workers, the best possible access to European markets for our manufacturing and services industries, and the best possible freedoms for our entrepreneurs and our global exporters, ensuring that Britain, after Brexit, will remain one of the best places in the world for a business to invest, to innovate, and to grow. The Independent Bank of England successfully cut interest rates to restore confidence in the wake of the vote. But as the economy responds over the coming months, fiscal policy may also have a role to play. So let me be clear. Throughout the negotiating process, we are ready to take whatever steps are necessary to protect this economy from turbulence. And when the process is over, we are ready to provide support to British businesses as they adjust to life outside the EU. Because Brexit does mean Brexit, and we are going to make a success of it. And in the meantime, I can offer some additional certainty to British business and other organisations bidding to receive EU funding while we are still a member. I've already guaranteed the funding for projects signed prior to this year's autumn statement. Today, I can go further. The Treasury will offer a guarantee to bidders whose projects meet UK priorities and value for money criteria, that if they secure multi-year EU funding before we exit, we will guarantee those payments after Britain has left the EU, protecting British jobs and businesses after Brexit. As Conservatives, we know, of course, that no one owes us a living, that a country has to live within its means. And a fundamental part of maintaining our global competitiveness is getting our public finances back in order. We should, of course, be proud of our achievements in fiscal consolidation. But the work that we began in 2010 is not finished. The deficit remains unsustainable, and the decision to leave the EU has introduced new fiscal uncertainty. Last year, the government borrowed £1 in every £10 we spent, and piling up debt for our children and our grandchildren is not only unsustainable, it's unfair, and more, it's downright unconservative. The British people elected us on a promise to restore fiscal discipline, and that is exactly what we are going to do. But we will do it in a pragmatic way, in a way that reflects the new circumstances we face. The fiscal policies that George Osborne set out were the right ones for that time. But when times change, we must change with them. So we will no longer target a surplus at the end of this Parliament. But make no mistake, the task of fiscal consolidation must continue. And it must happen within the context of a clear credible fiscal framework that will control day-to-day public expenditure, deliver value for money, and get Britain back living within our means. At the autumn statement in November, I will set out our plan to deliver long-term fiscal sustainability while responding to the consequences of short-term uncertainty and recognising the need for investment to build an economy that works for everyone. A new plan for the new circumstances Britain faces. A Conservative government demonstrating the flexibility, the common sense and the pragmatism that has made our party the most successful political party in British history. Now contrast this balanced, responsible approach with the shambles of Labour in Liverpool last week. In denial about their record in office, deluded about the state of the public finances today. Not once did Jeremy Corbyn apologise for the mess that Labour left behind. On the contrary, his shadow secretary says their mistake was not to have spent more. Now, if you think their past record is bad, let's look at their plans for Britain's future. Corbyn's big idea is to spend an extra £500 billion. That's £7,700 for every man, woman and child in the UK. I just hope he remembers when he goes to bed at night to water the magic money tree. Now look, we could speculate as to how Labour would pay for a spending splurge on this scale, but fortunately, we don't have to, because we have the answer from Labour's last Shadow Chancellor, Chris Leslie. This is what he said last week about how Labour would fund Corbyn's plan. You'd have to double income tax. You'd have to double national insurance. You'd have to double council tax. And you'd have to double VAT as well. So there we have it, from the mouth of one of their own. Labour condemned as totally unfit to govern this country. With nothing to offer the hard-working people of Britain. And as always, it would be the poorest and the most vulnerable who would pay the biggest price. So, my friends, we in this party have a great and solemn responsibility because we alone carry the burden of ensuring that Labour can never again wreck the British economy. The Conservative commitment is to build a country and an economy that works for everyone, to raise our living standards and grow our national wealth, not just for today, but for future generations too. We know how to do that, we Conservatives. We've proved it time and time again, cleaning up Labour's mess. We'll do it by making the British economy the most outward-looking, most dynamic, most competitive, high-wage, high-skill, low-tax economy in the world. We do it by making sure that after our EU exit, we continue to attract the brightest and the best, the highest skilled and the most dynamic entrepreneurs, scientists, engineers and managers from around the world, building a strong and vibrant economy as the bedrock of our strong and vibrant society. A Conservative vision of the future of Britain. And I'll tell you this, it's a million miles away from the la-la land Labour was describing in Liverpool last week. But to deliver that strong, prosperous economy requires long-term sustainable growth. And long-term sustainable growth requires us to raise our national productivity. Now look, before you switch off, I know that productivity doesn't necessarily set political pulses racing. But bear with me while I try to convince you that it should. How about this? You probably know that our national productivity is lower than that of the US and Germany. Perhaps you even feel somewhat resigned to that fact. But did you know that it's lower than France and Italy too? And had you made the connection about what that means in the real world? Because what it means is that millions of British workers are working longer hours for lower pay than their counterparts in Europe and the US. And that has to change if we're going to build an economy that works for everyone. If we raised our productivity by just 1% every year, within a decade, we would add £250 billion to the size of our economy. That's £9,000 for every household in Britain. So productivity should set political pulses racing. It's a decades-old problem, swept under the carpet for too long. But under this government, we're going to put it in the spotlight, right at the forefront of our policy agenda and at the heart of our industrial strategy. We know where to start. Our productivity performance in this country is grossly uneven, still too reliant upon a few key sectors, still too focused on London and the South East. The good news is that we know how to do productivity. Parts of London have the highest productivity in Europe. The bad news is that the productivity gap between our capital and our second, third and fourth cities is greater than in any other major economy in the world. And closing that gap will be key to Britain's future outside the EU. That's why we're doing regional devolution deals, and why tackling those regional differences will be one of the key drivers for the industrial strategy that Greg Clark is developing now. And then there's the skills challenge. We've made huge progress over the last 6 years. How many people in this room 10 years ago would have believed that in every year since 2014, maths would be the most popular A-level subject in English schools? But it was. What a tribute that is to conservative education reforms. But despite that progress, there is still a huge gap between our skills base and that of our key competitors. It's holding people back from achieving their full potential, and it's holding our nation back in the global race. And there's more. Our stock of public infrastructure, our roads, railways, flood defences, languishes near the bottom of the developed countries' league table after decades of underinvestment. And our businesses too are not investing enough. All of this must change to build an economy that works for everyone. We need to close that gap with careful, targeted public investment in high-value infrastructure and encouragement of more private business investment in British enterprises. And if we're going to see economic growth distributed more evenly across the regions and sectors of our economy, and more fairly between the generations, there's another big challenge that needs to be tackled: the unaffordability of housing. Because despite the action we've taken, fewer and fewer young people are able to afford to get their foot on the first rung of the housing ladder and buy their own home. Quite simply, we're not building enough new homes. This is a long-term challenge, but there are short-term measures we can take. And the package that Sajid Javid has announced earlier, the £3 billion Home Builders Fund, £2 billion of new investment for accelerated construction on public land, is a clear demonstration of this government's determination to tackle this challenge using all the tools at our disposal. Because making housing more affordable will be a vital part of building a country that works for everyone. And this government is determined that the dream of home ownership should be for the many, not for the few. Ensuring that we have world-class infrastructure is vital to maintaining our competitiveness. But it is a very long-term agenda, one that can be, and often has been, knocked off course by short-term political considerations. That's why we announced the National Infrastructure Commission, to define independently the nation's long-term infrastructure needs, to prioritise and plan, to test value for money, to ensure that every penny spent on infrastructure is properly targeted to deliver maximum benefit. And today, I recommit to putting the Commission at the very heart of our plans to renew and expand Britain's infrastructure, making sure that it is long-term economics, not short-term politics, that drive Britain's vital infrastructure investment. Part of Britain's productivity transformation will come, of course, from innovation. But the new disruptive technologies, which are right now making their way from university labs and company R&D facilities into early-stage production, offer Britain a much bigger prize than incremental productivity improvements. Because at the cutting edge of many of these new technologies, the UK is becoming a world leader once again, not just in the science, but in the application of it and in the innovation that follows. Over the last few years, unnoticed by most of us, entrepreneurs and scientists from home and abroad have been turning Britain into a hub of tech innovation, and global businesses have followed, hungry for the inventions and innovations they are generating, developing technologies that will change fundamentally the way we work and the way we live. Driverless cars, graphene, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, virtual reality, advanced robotics. I'm going to be honest with you, I had no idea until a few weeks ago just how much I don't know. And I had even less idea how much I still wouldn't be able to understand, even once some clever people had explained it to me. But the truth is, this is the future, our future and our children's future. A whole new world that really would have sounded like science fiction just a few years ago, but is now a reality taking shape in laboratories, incubators and factories across Britain. There's a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Britain to cement its role as a leader in tech innovation. And my ambition is clear. I want to see what is invented here, developed here. I want to see what is developed here, produced here. I want to see jobs. I want to see profits. And yes, I want to see tax receipts here in Britain. I want to see the fruit of British genius being harvested here in Britain as we move into a fourth industrial revolution, creating jobs, wealth and success to future-proof our economy post-Brexit. We're well placed to do it, more competitive than ever, up to 7th place in the World League table last year from 10th the year before. We have world-leading universities and research institutes, a trusted legal system, an advantageous time zone, the English language, our secret and unfair advantage, and vibrant markets. At 20%, we have one of the world's most competitive corporation tax rates, and as it falls to 17% by the end of this Parliament, it will be more attractive still. Of course, this explosion of creativity and innovation that I've talked about hasn't happened solely or even mainly because of government policy, but it could easily be snuffed out by the wrong government policy. So we must carefully maintain the conditions that have brought this activity to Britain in the first place, including the ability to attract the brightest and the best to work here in our high-tech industries. And where we see that there are government interventions that work, we should be prepared to make them. So today, I can announce another £220 million of support to tech innovation, spread across 2 initiatives. £100 million to extend the Biomedical Catalyst Fund, which takes revolutionary science from the lab and transforms it into deliverable healthcare interventions. and a further £120 million to nurture the tech transfer offices that put universities and entrepreneurs together to get that science out of the lab and into the factory. That is a Conservative government investing in Britain's future. I've made my argument that we will not overcome Britain's productivity challenge unless we tackle the serious inequalities in performance between cities and regions. That's an economic analysis. But this is about politics too, because one of the key messages of the referendum campaign was that large parts of our country feel left behind. They see the country getting richer, but they don't feel part of that success. A dangerous divide is opening up between those who believe they have a stake in the economy and those who do not. And it's one of the central missions of this government to tackle that divide, to see the benefits of economic growth shared more evenly across the regions and across the generations. And a key part of this agenda is harnessing the economic power of our cities. The Northern Powerhouse project takes a visionary approach, linking the great cities of the North into a coherent economic entity, an interconnected region that raises productivity and delivers growth by making it easier and cheaper for firms and individuals to move goods, people, and ideas. And I want to pledge to you today that the Treasury, under my leadership, will continue to drive the Northern Powerhouse project, working in partnership with local leaders to see it deliver its potential for people in the North. But I also want to tell you that our ambition is not limited to the Northern Powerhouse. We want to create the conditions for success in the North, the South, and everywhere in between. And there's nowhere more ripe to benefit from a similar approach than the Midlands. The Midlands engine, with its hub here in Birmingham, powers 11.7 million lives, generates £220 billion for our economy, produces 18% of UK goods exports and more than a fifth of our total manufacturing output. In this great region, there are 320,000 more people in work than there were in 2010. But both productivity and economic growth have lagged behind the UK average. So we've developed our long-term economic plan for the Midlands, and it's already delivering. But we can and we will do more. We're working with the West Midlands Combined Authority on a second devolution deal to include new powers on transport, criminal justice, data, planning and skills. And with Andy Street, our fantastic mayoral candidate for the West Midlands, now in place, a great future is within the region's grasp. At the very least, I can promise you this region will never be knowingly undersold. The Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, two great projects that can be emulated across Britain. Indeed, I suspect the limiting factor may only be our ability to think up snappy titles for new regional projects. But be assured, we have passed a tipping point in devolution in this country, a decisive and irreversible shift in the economic and political power balance, and Britain's economy will be the better and the bigger for it. Conference, the British people have made a bold decision. Our party trusted them with the nation's future in a referendum, and now they trust our party to deliver on their decision. We will not let them down. We are going to leave the European Union, to repatriate our laws, to assert the supremacy of our courts, to control our borders. But we are not going to turn our backs on the nations of Europe. Let us resolve that as we leave their union, we will remain the best of neighbours, the closest of trade associates, the strongest of security partners. But our economic future must not be defined by Brexit alone. So as we tread that path to becoming an independent, sovereign country once again, and forge a new and exciting role for our nation in the world, let us resolve to tackle the challenges we face at home with renewed vigour, dealing with the deficit, raising our productivity, rebalancing our economy, rebuilding our infrastructure, and ensuring that everyone in every part of our country can contribute to and benefit from the growth that follows. Paying our way in the world, standing tall amongst our competitors, attracting the brightest and the best to deliver the vibrant, successful economy that will mean when future generations look back on our decision in 2016, they will see not the end of an era, but the beginning of a new age. Not a country turning inward, but a nation reaching out, decisively, confidently, to grasp new opportunities. A bigger, better, greater Britain, truly a country that works for everyone. Thank you.
And the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, finishes his first keynote address to the Tory party conference as Chancellor. It was a pretty long speech, short on anything new or any new announcements. Maybe he's saving them all up for the autumn statement on November the 23rd. He boasted about the recovery that had occurred under this government. He said the Conservatives were the true party of the British working people. He said a divide was opening up between those who were doing well out of the economy and those who weren't. It remains to be seen what is going to be done about that. He had a swipe at Ed Balls, who of course is now more famous as a dancer than a shadow chancellor. He had a few things to say about fiscal policy. He confirmed what we already know, that they're no longer aiming for a surplus in the national budget by 2020. Indeed, it could be that they'll drop the very idea of aiming for a surplus. But he did talk about fiscal sustainability, which suggests that he still hopes that the deficit over time will continue to come down. But I guess what it means is the deficit never came down anything as quickly as Mr. Osborne first told us it would in 2010. He then moved to a new, more slower reduction for 2015 to 2020. Now Mr. Hammond, I think, is probably moving to stage 3 of deficit reduction, which means it will be even slower than stage 2 under Mr. Osborne. And he did say that he was going to look to invest in various areas as well. He's already announced something on housing. We don't know yet what else, but he did say we had to do that. He spent some time on productivity, and I suppose we'll think that an increase in investment may address that. Paul Johnson of the IFS, Institute for Fiscal Studies, is here. We always like to turn to him. Have I missed anything important out, or is that broadly it?
No, I don't think it was anything terribly new. We knew that he wasn't going to aim for this surplus in 2020, and he's really given us no sense of what his new fiscal framework or rule is going to be, and that doesn't surprise me. I mean, surely that will come in the autumn statement, or indeed later. He's dealing with a lot of uncertainty here. He'd focused a lot on productivity, which is clearly a big issue for the economy going forward. It's what underlies wage growth. He gave us some sums there. He said that if you increase productivity on 1% a year, you get hundreds of billions of pounds more after 10 years. Absolutely true. The problem, of course, is how do you deliver that productivity?
And how does government deliver it too?
How indeed, and he was right about some things. It does depend on skills, it does depend on infrastructure and building, and some things that governments have decided not to do in the past. I mean, we could have had a decision about a runway a lot quicker, and that would have been good for productivity. Right. You can build extra roads, but people don't like them. You can build lots of extra houses on green fields, but people don't like them. Those are all good for productivity, so there are some big decisions to take there. The other thing that he said, which I thought was quite interesting, was he really did focus and reaffirm George Osborne's commitment to devolution and to giving additional powers to local authorities and to regions. I think that was quite, for me, quite a big part of what he said. There's no, it would seem, going back from what I think we'll see over time is quite a big change in the way that we run our economy and politics.
Maybe if he really believed in devolution, he'd move the Treasury to Manchester.
Well, maybe he would. But
then you would have a whole different view of the world.
Since Parliament's going to be moving out of its building soon, they could move the whole shebang up there.
So, in the broad sweep of things, it does look like he's going to borrow a bit more to invest, but we don't know how much. And he's going to slow down, while still maintaining fiscal sustainability, he's going to slow down the pace of deficit reduction.
That's my guess. And I mean, let's remember that if, as we expect, the economy grows probably just a bit less quickly than was hoped back in March, even if he follows through exactly with George Osborne's spending cuts and so on, we still won't get to budget surplus. So simply saying we're not going to get there doesn't actually tell us anything about the scale of any other change. Now, there's clearly some indication of what look like some really quite modest increases in spending on house building and so on, which might help both in the short run and the long run. But I think we are going to have to wait until the autumn statement on November the 23rd to find out any more detail, and possibly a bit longer than that, because if I were him, I think I'd still be waiting for more news on the economy over the next year to 18 months before making the big choices.
Yes, exactly. Because we don't know what the real course of the economy is going to be yet. We've had forecasts of being going up and down and change all the time. It was a little unfair to have a crack at Ed Balls, was it not, when his overall fiscal policy now sounds a little like Ed Balls?
Well, the last Labour manifesto suggested aiming for what would essentially be a 20 or 30 billion pound deficit by the end of the Parliament, because they would have been happy to borrow to invest. Now, the Chancellor didn't say that's what he was aiming for, but as you say, certainly pushing in that kind of direction.
All right, Paul Johnson, thanks for being with us. Now, yesterday was Brexit Day here at the conference. We learned, of course, that Article 50 is going to be triggered before the end of March next year. That starts the formal 2-year process of negotiation, meaning that on that timetable we're out before Easter of 2019 at the latest. There will be a vote in Parliament also next spring confirming that Britain will leave at the end of that process. They're calling it the Great Repeal Bill, though why it's great and what exactly it repeals we're not quite sure. Adam was listening to the speeches. He's trying to get some of the answers from the Brexit ministers in charge. Here's our Adam.
A speech from the Prime Minister on a Sunday at Tory conference. Most unusual. Must be something big, like when she'll start the legal process of leaving the EU.
Let me be absolutely clear. There will be no unnecessary delays in invoking Article 50. We will invoke it when we are ready, and we will be ready soon. We will invoke Article 50 no later than the end of March next year.
And Brexit means Brexit. Which means what, exactly?
We voted to leave the European Union and become a fully independent sovereign country. We will do what independent sovereign countries do. We will decide for ourselves how we control immigration, and we will be free to pass our own laws. But we will seek the best deal possible as we negotiate a new agreement with the European Union.
Then there was the big reveal, the Great Repeal Bill.
We will soon put before Parliament a Great Repeal Bill, which will remove from the statute book, once and for all, the European Communities Act. This historic bill, which will be included in the next Queen's speech, will mean that the 1972 Act, the legislation that gives direct effect to all EU law in Britain, will no longer apply from the date upon which we formally leave the European Union. And its effect will be clear.
And what about the three Brexiteers, the trio of government ministers who have to draw up the detailed plans for all of this? They're David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, and Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary. Rumour is they've been told to bite their tongues and not talk to the media much this week. We'll see. Dr. Fox, are you keeping a low profile? Have you been told to keep a low profile?
No, does this look like a low profile to you?
Oh, sorry. Are you going to come on the programme this week?
Not at the moment.
Are you allowed to do interviews? People are saying you've been sat on.
Who, me?
Yeah, you've been sat on and you're not allowed to talk to the media. It's quite fast, David Davis. No proper interviews, but 2 out of the 3 did give speeches as part of Brexit Sunday.
I know some people have suggested we should just ignore the rules.
tear up the treaties we've entered into. I say that's not how Britain behaves. What kind of message would that send to the rest of the world? If we want to be treated with goodwill, we must act with goodwill.
I think that vote on June the 23rd, I think that was a vote for economic and political freedom, and freedom for this country.
And at a packed Fringe event, Liam Fox revealed he shed a tear on referendum night when he realised his side had won. That was Brexit Sunday. The Tories just hope this conference doesn't turn into Brexit Monday, Brexit Tuesday, and Brexit Wednesday too.
Our Adam reporting there. I'm joined now by two Conservative MPs, Bernard Jenkin, he campaigned for Brexit, Dominic Grieve, he backed the Remain campaign, now supposed the Open Britain campaign group. Welcome to you both. Dominic Grieve, we still don't know what the country's negotiating position is going to be, but we know when Article 50 is going to be triggered, and we know that the 1972 Act is going to, everything in that will be put onto the British statute book when we leave. Are you happy with that approach?
Putting the 72 Act onto the British statute book and repealing it is obviously indispensable if we're leaving. But it doesn't answer the question for business about what the relationship with the EU from outside will be thereafter. Bear in mind, at the moment we put it in the statute book, after we leave, divergence will start to occur immediately. And I think the key issue for business is what will be the framework of our relations with the EU from outside of it, which will enable them to carry on trading. So in a sense, the Great Repeal Act is, I think, it's important, but it's not the central part of Brexit.
And when do we get to know, Bernard Jenkin, even a rough idea of what our relationship will be with the single market once we've left?
I think it will, if we have constructive talks and reach a constructive agreement, we will tidy up all the detailed things like agriculture and fish and data and mobile telephones and civil aviation into the withdrawal agreement, but hope there will also be an interim agreement to keep the tariffs at zero, to keep the services sector open on both sides, so that we have time to develop a comprehensive economic partnership over a much longer period. The European Union's problem is twofold. First of all, they tend to take a very long time to develop trading relationships. I mean, how long's TTIP been going? How long has it taken to do the Canadian deal? More than 6 years. It will take a very long time. And the second problem is, to do such a comprehensive agreement requires unanimity and requires ratification by all the member states. Well, we can't possibly have a withdrawal agreement that's dependent upon unanimity and ratification by all the member state parliaments. We've got to have a cleaner, swifter break than that.
Okay.
We can see the demand for that coming from German industry, for example.
What do you say to that, Dominic Grieve?
I don't disagree with Bernard about the sort of frustrations that we may encounter in the course of negotiating Brexit. But the bottom line is that we are enmeshed economically with our European partners. And unless we want a chaotic Brexit at the end of it, which means that we revert to a WTO relationship, we are going to have to negotiate to build structures which indeed will fetter us to some extent thereafter. It doesn't matter how you do it, that's how international relations are conducted. And so I always worry that there's an element of fantasy about Brexit, that somehow this wonderful moment comes, we have the Great Repeal Bill, the day comes when we leave, and suddenly there's a brave new world. There isn't, there's a new world, but it's a world of complex commercial relationships underpinned by new treaties, just as we had old treaties. And whilst it's true the new treaties may no longer be regulated by the European Court of Justice, so we escape some of the mechanisms of the EU, actually it's all going to be replaced by a new apparatus of international treaties, just as our international relations commercially with other states outside the EU is regulated at present.
He doesn't seem to think it's worth a candle, in other words.
Well, he was on the other side of the debate.
No, I've said
that. The point is that we can have a much simpler and more straightforward relationship. I mean, the model might be the kind of relationship that Canada has with the United States. The United States Supreme Court doesn't make laws in Canada. The Congress doesn't make laws in
Well,
Canada.
that's a free trade agreement.
It's a free trade agreement, yes.
Is that what you would like?
Yes, that's what we want.
What would be wrong with that?
Nothing wrong with the free trade agreement, but I think if you look at the reality of the Canadian-US free trade agreement, because of the preponderance of economic power on one side of that equation, it's one which ultimately gets driven by the larger partner, and you can't escape that. Now,
but there's no pressure in Canada to come out of it.
Of course
Indeed,
not.
if anything, the
It's
pressure is in America to do it away.
It's absolutely vital to the Canadians' national interest. But the point I'm trying to make is that we talk about Independence Day when we voted to leave.
Yes.
And I, myself, have never quite seen it in that light. It seems to me that we live in an interdependent world where the purity of independence, to which some people seem to aspire through Brexit, is unlikely ever to be realised. And so you have to be hard-headed and pragmatic about what you want to achieve and how you can achieve it.
Well, we won't need to submit to the European Court of Justice or to the lawmaking functions of the European Union in the way that we do at the moment. That will give us our independence. As Theresa May said yesterday, whatever immigration policy we want to have with the European Union, we will be able to decide for ourselves. And of course, there is another interesting factor here, that the United Kingdom imports far more from the Europeans than we export. So they've got a huge vested interest in maintaining free trade with us.
We had that during the campaign, but it would seem from everything you say that you accept, if you don't want to be justiciable by the ECJ, you want to end freedom of movement, that you are not going to be a member of the single market.
Correct.
That's impossible now.
Yes. There's no doubt about it.
And you replace that with a free trade agreement.
Yeah, that may take some time.
So
and we'll
what do
need
we-
an interim arrangement. And
Is
the
that
interim
likely?
arrangement might not even be formally agreed. We could just say, look, until we've got a free trade agreement, we're just going to keep our tariffs at zero. We're just going to keep our borders open for services.
But even if they put tariffs up against us?
I mean, it'd be interesting, wouldn't it, if we said, look, we're open, you carry on trading with us, you carry on selling us all your stuff tariff-free, and they say, no, we're not having that, we're putting up tariffs. I mean, what's the European Union going to look like?
It might be a good way to destroy the British car industry.
Well,
if we have no tariffs and they have tariffs.
If they apply tariffs, I imagine we would have to apply tariffs too.
That's a
but let's
different
just
matter.
face it, we will probably generate 8 or 9 billion of revenue on the tariffs on imports from the EU. We could cut corporate taxes, we could reduce employment costs, we could increase investment
You may have to give
allowances.
money to Nissan to invest because they want compensation.
Yes, I think it's perfectly reasonable that we give offsetting. You know, if we're raising all that revenue, we spend it on making this a very attractive country to invest in.
So Tory subsidies for big
Not
business.
subsidies, cutting taxes, increasing investment allowances, cutting employment costs, increasing training grants or grants for research and development. There's lots of positive things we can do within the state aid rules.
Our biggest export market, other than the EU, our biggest individual country export market is the United States. We don't have a free trade agreement with the United States. Our rules and Europe's rules are obviously already very enmeshed. Could we not move quite quickly, if there was goodwill on both sides, to a free trade agreement?
That's possible, and indeed I'd be very much in favour of trying to achieve it. But
You accept we can't be in the single market either, as a member?
No, I don't accept that. We could be in the single market if we're prepared to accept the constraints that the single market requires. And within that, I also accept the possibility that it might be possible for us to negotiate a status for the United Kingdom which is somewhat different from other countries. All those things are possible.
But you couldn't be in the single
these are-
market without being subject to the ECJ, could you?
Well, I think you'd be subject to the ECJ. You'd be subject to the EFTA court, which is
Well,
in effect a sort of younger brother of
But
the
whose
ECJ.
jurisprudence follows case law in the ECJ.
Exactly.
So
And indeed, you would lose the influence in the formulation of the regulations. I'm a pragmatist, but the reality of trade and mutual interdependency is that you're going to have to accept a framework of rules. If you don't, then the question is, what will the knock-on economic consequences be? In my constituency, I have lots of businesses that are there because they have access into the single market. And if they don't have access into the single market, they will move away.
But they will have
And I don't
access.
want
The
to see
question
that
is they
happen.
don't know what terms. I mean, why should any, just a final question, why should any major multinational at the moment, wondering where to expand next, bring its foreign direct investment to Britain until everything you've been talking about is resolved? I mean, it would be a blind investment.
Well, I think that's why there is going to be pressure on not so much hard or soft, but quick. And quick means simple.
All right.
And simple means not getting involved in unanimity provisions or complexity. Simple means perhaps offering a unilateral free trade deal to the EU on exit, pending a much longer arrangement later on. And also, it means giving assurances to investors along the lines that Nissen are asking for.
We could call that the meerkat Brexit, simples. You've probably not seen the commercial. You don't.
I have seen. I know what meerkats are.
Thank you very much. That's what happens when you bring up popular culture with Tory MPs. They're nowhere. So the Chancellor Philip Hammond has made it clear in his conference speech that he was hoping to break with austerity policies to some extent from his predecessor. By how much, we still don't know. We'll have to wait till the autumn statement for that. But here's a key section of his speech.
The British people elected us on a promise to restore fiscal discipline, and that is exactly what we are going to do. But we will do it in a pragmatic way, in a way that reflects the new circumstances we face. The fiscal policies that George Osborne set out were the right ones for that time. But when times change, we must change with them. So we will no longer target a surplus at the end of this Parliament. But make no mistake, the task of fiscal consolidation must continue.
All right. That was the Chancellor. I'm joined now by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, David Gauke. Welcome back on the programme. The Chancellor boasted about the recovery that has happened under this government, but the fact is that GDP per capita has barely moved in the past 6 years.
Well, it is the case that of the G7 countries, GDP as a whole has grown, I think, faster in the UK than in any other place.
But that's partly because of the amount of immigration that has taken place that you said you would stop. If you divide our GDP by the number of people in the country today compared to the number of people in 2010, it's barely grown at all.
Well, I think you still have to put this in the context of what we inherited, a hugely difficult set of challenges in terms of the public finances, in terms of the aftershocks of the financial crisis, and a Eurozone crisis that had a significant impact upon us. And over that period of time, we have seen a very large creation in terms of the creation of jobs, and in recent years in particular, GDP growth has been stronger.
But
as I say,
not
I mean,
per head.
Well, I think a lot of the issues were in sort of 2011 and 2012, where we were particularly faced with problems of the Eurozone crisis and the after effects of the financial shock, which meant funding for businesses were very difficult. Particularly if you look over the last few years, the UK has been growing strongly, I think, under any measure you want to look at.
Well, by GDP per head, it hasn't, actually. That's my point. One of the reasons for that, of course, is that for most of the time you've been in power, real wages have fallen. Real wages have not grown, so people have been overall worse off in terms of the money they've raised. In Germany and France, real wages have risen. So again, not quite the economic recovery the Chancellor was saying.
Well, the first point to make is, to some extent, particularly if you're making a comparison with France and Germany, real wages in the context where we've seen a very substantial increase in the labour force, which has not been the case in France and Germany in the same way. So there has been a degree in which there's a bit of a trade-off between the two. But it then begs the question, well, what do we do about it? And as I suspect Paul Johnson was saying to you a moment or so ago, if you want to drive up real wages, ultimately this is about driving up productivity, and a lot of Philip's speech today was about how we can improve productivity. Now that's a long-term challenge. There's a number of steps we've taken over the last 6 years, but there is still more to do.
So far with no impact.
Well, in terms of, if you're looking at, for example, improving the skills base, that is something that isn't going to be a matter that is solved in 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 years. That is a long-term project. If we're looking at encouraging more investment in the UK, and our policies on, for example, corporation tax have attracted more investment to the UK, but the benefits of that investment is something that you see over a long period of time.
Well,
and just because something is long-term doesn't mean governments should not focus on it.
No, but you've been in power 6 years, and you would think that at least we may begin to see the glimmerings of some progress. And yet UK productivity per hour hasn't moved since 2007. Our productivity per hour has not moved now for 9 years.
Well, one of the particular factors, and it's interesting that you used 2007 as a base point.
Well, just from before the crash.
No, I think it's a perfectly reasonable point to make, actually, because the hit of the financial crisis on our productivity was very considerable and continues to be considerable. Now, the question is, how do we improve our productivity? And that focus on improving our infrastructure, improving our skills, attracting investment to the UK, I think have got to be the way forward.
But you've slashed infrastructure spending.
Well, we inherited a very, very substantial reduction in infrastructure.
But
actually, over the course of the last Parliament, we increased infrastructure spending compared to the plans that we inherited.
Right, but overall, as a percentage of GDP, it doesn't rise. And indeed, if anything, I think it declines a bit, and compared to other countries, it's rather small.
Well, if you look at government spending on infrastructure, along with PPP, the public-private partnership, actually the UK is very comparable with other countries. There's more we need to do to encourage private sector investment in infrastructure. But the reality is the government is, if you let's say transport infrastructure, we're seeing a very substantial increase in the roads budget over the course of this Parliament. It's already increasing by 3 times over this period of time. We're investing more in the railways, for example, than any time since Victorian times. So we are increasing expenditure, and particularly on that high-value infrastructure where there is a good economic return. And what the Chancellor made reference to today is his enthusiasm to look at ways in which we can do that, consistent with a commitment to getting the public finances under control.
How can you be the self-styled Workers' Party when 6 million working people in this country earn less than the living wage?
Well, we are in a position where we have created a lot of jobs in this country. We have brought in the national living wage, so that is providing a significant pay rise to millions of people. We're bringing that in. We have cut taxes for the low paid, taken millions out of income tax.
6 million people earning less than the living wage, defined as £9.15 in London, £7.85 elsewhere in the UK. Not a lot of money for people at this conference, and yet 6 million people earn less than that. That cannot be right for a self-styled Workers' Party.
Well, so what do you do about it? You ensure that
that's
those
your
people. Yeah, no, well, I'll answer it. You ensure that those people pay less in tax. You ensure that you have a higher national living wage than you would otherwise do. But actually, I come back to this point. If we want to have a high wage, high skill economy, we've got to make sure that we've got the environment in place to improve our skills, to improve our infrastructure. And also, I make this point, it is very important that we are a country that continues to create lots of jobs. And our record over the last 6 years in terms of job creation as a country is extremely strong by any standards, historical or international. And it is good that we are not a society that's plagued with mass unemployment.
No, but again, you're the self-styled Workers' Party. Mr. Hammond said it today, Mrs. May said it yesterday, and yet UK workers work longer hours for less pay than the original EU 15. Mm-hmm. So what's the Workers' Party doing about that?
And the reason why that is the case, and as the Chancellor made clear in his speech, is because our productivity levels are not as high as a number of our competitors. So it comes back to this point, which is sometimes worthy. I think Philip made the point about doesn't always set the pulses racing. How do we improve productivity as a country?
Which hasn't moved since you came to power.
And these are long-term challenges, but what we saw today from the Chancellor in a, I thought, very serious and thoughtful speech was outlining ways in which we can look to improve that productivity, how we can make some long-term decisions that ensures that the UK's productivity increases, and it's through that that we benefit people's wages.
For 6 years, indeed in the run-up to the 2010 election, so more than 6 years, your party told us that the guiding light in its welfare reforms and its attitude to the economy would be to make work pay. That if you got a job, that would, if you and did the right thing, which Mr. Osborne used to say all the time, it would pay to work. And yet 6 years after you've been in power, 50% of our fellow citizens who are in poverty have at least one family member in work. So in what way has that made work pay? They're working and they live in poverty.
Well, what we've seen is a significant increase in the number of jobs in this country. I think something like 2.7 million more jobs.
But they're still in poverty.
In this economy. One of the reasons why we've had this, and it's undoubtedly, a success. As a government minister, I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But undoubtedly, it has been a success of policy in the last 6 years that employment numbers are as high as they are. And one of the reasons why that has happened is that actually welfare reform has played a part in more people are essentially seeing that it is worthwhile for them working. Now, is there still more to do? Of course there is. I'm acknowledging
Minister, it's not just a case of there's more to do. Relative poverty, which is still the official measure of this government, relative poverty among those in work is at record levels. Record levels. How does that make you the Workers' Party?
Well,
the Workers' Party are going to be revolting if you carry on like this.
What we're seeing is actually a reduction in the number of workless households in this country.
No, I understand that, but my point is in-work poverty.
Yeah.
That you said work would pay, make work pay, get a job, do the right thing, and you will prosper in a Tory Britain. Whereas among those who are in work, poverty is at record levels.
What we're seeing is people who previously would have been workless are now in employment. That has got to be a good thing. Now, the next challenge, if you like, is how do we ensure that those people who perhaps in a previous era would have been out of work, they are now in work but not earning sufficient. The next challenge is to ensure that those people go on and earn more. And again, I come back to how do you do that? Well, you can improve their living standards by taking them out of income tax, which we've done in 4 million cases.
These figures take that into account.
You can help them by having a national living wage, whereby they are better paid, and we introduce that, and that will
take it into account,
and that will increase over the course over the Parliament. But fundamentally, what you can do is ensure that we've got more people who are highly skilled, and that we have a society that is more productive, and that increase in productivity ends up benefiting the people who are working, and that is, if you like, exactly the point the Chancellor was making in his speech today. How do we improve that productivity?
I know you're not going to give us any details because it's got to wait for the autumn statement in November. But are we going to borrow more to invest? As a general principle,
I think that I'd make 2 points about the autumn statement. First of all is the acknowledgement, because of the uncertainty of the Brexit vote, it is likely that tax receipts will be lower than was previously projected. So that means that we are not in a position to meet our 2019-20 surplus target.
So the deficit reduction will continue to reduce, but at a slower pace?
Well, we'll see, and we'll see what
it might not even continue to reduce.
I'm not going to speculate, because we'll see what the Office of Budget Responsibility determines, and we await their numbers. So that's the first point. The second point is that we are in a set of circumstances where interest rates are very low. The way the gilts market have moved, that we can borrow more cheaply than previously, and if there is a case for high value infrastructure, and we have to be pretty tough about this. This is not about relaxing day-to-day spending, but if there is a case for high-value infrastructure that helps our long-term productivity, then, as the Chancellor, I think, has made clear, is we're willing to look at that.
All right. David Gott, thank you for coming to speak to us after the Chancellor's speech. And of course, this autumn statement is on November the 23rd. We will bring it all to you here on the Daily Politics on BBC Two, probably from about 11:30 till 3 o'clock it usually goes. That's on November the 23rd. Now, earlier the Community Secretary, Sajid Javid, made his speech to conference, so let's have a listen to some of what he had to say.
1.5 million households contain at least one adult who says he or she would love to buy or rent their own home, but they simply cannot afford to do so. Harold Macmillan, he put it best more than 90 years ago. Housing is not a question of conservatism or socialism, he said. It's a question of humanity. Tackling this housing shortfall isn't about political expediency. It's a moral duty. And it's one that falls on all of us, not just in Parliament, but on businesses, in local government, and in local communities. I'm not afraid to stand up here and say that this country has not built enough homes. We have to be honest about it. Now, in the last year of 4 records, we managed to deliver more than 170,000 additional properties across England. It's not a bad number, but it's far fewer than we need. We need to do much better. Everyone agrees that we need more homes, but too many of us object to them being next to us. We've got to change that attitude. So my message today is clear. It's time to get building.
That was Sajid Javid. He made some announcements about trying to beef up the housing programme and get the numbers behind current rate of completion, about 145,000 in England. So the motto of the conference is a country that works for everyone, echoing Theresa May's words on the Downing Street steps when she first became Prime Minister. Mrs May styling the Tories yesterday as the Workers' Party, repeated by Mr Hammond when he made his speech this morning. We're joined now by the former Universities Minister David Willetts. He's now Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation. It's a think tank which focuses on living standards. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Plenty of rhetoric about being the Workers' Party and a country that works for everyone. But I think you heard my interview with David Gauke. There's a long way to go to turn that rhetoric into reality.
There is. David was right, of course, to say that productivity is a key part of the challenge. But there's another part of the challenge, which is what Sajid was talking about. Our work at Resolution shows housing costs are one of the big pressures on living standards for people on low incomes. The increase in the housing costs they pay looks like to be the equivalent of about a 14 pence increase in income tax. If we can get more housing built, and because there's an increase in supply, see over time the cost of housing starts falling, then people will feel that as an improvement in their living standards. Their wages will go further. At the moment, low-income families are having to put more and more of their wage into paying rents.
Into paying rent, both in the private and the public sector.
Indeed.
To social.
Indeed.
And also, I was looking at the figures, that because we failed to build enough houses to meet the demand, the housing benefit bill has gone through the roof because people on average incomes can't afford these rents, so the state has to subsidise.
Exactly, and we end up...
rent. It's a double hit.
It is. You're absolutely right, Andrew. We end up with more people on means-tested benefits. And if people go from youth into middle age and they're still renters, the long-term challenge is what if we've got many pensioners who aren't owner-occupiers? What if we've got millions of pensioners claiming housing benefit? So it actually makes sense in terms of getting a long-term grip on public spending to make it easier for people to own their own homes. And that's why I think what Sajid said today was absolutely the right thing.
Should there not also be a massive council house building programme?
Well, it's interesting you should say that. I mean, when I look at what the Conservative Party did in the 1950s...
Indeed, 300,000 houses a year. Harold Macmillan, Housing Minister.
Yeah, and one of the ways he did that was by a combination of private house building and public building. And I think already with Sajid's statement today, I think the days when all the building had to be private building, I think that's not on itself going to get us enough housing built. So some of them will, I think, have to be public sector house building. And I was brought up around Birmingham. Here in Birmingham, they put up lots of prefabs in the 1950s. They needed to do something to house people, and we need that same urgency. And I think
not prefabs, I assume.
Well, there is actually quite an interesting debate about whether we can make the cost of building houses lower. That's a different story. But certainly, I think we're now seeing this government focus on getting more houses built.
But one of the issues
right.
on the housing issue, and you acquire housing has such an issue on poverty and on benefits and on people's ability to get on as well. But not only do we fail to provide enough houses for our people, even when we do, we build the smallest new homes in the European Union. 76 square meters is the average size. Even in Denmark, it's 137. Holland, which is so crowded they have to reclaim the sea, 115 square meters. We treat our people really badly in this regard.
And that is because the price of land is so high. A big part of the cost of a house is the cost of the land. And when you have highly restrictive planning arrangements, which mean that there are relatively small areas of land you can build on, that pushes up the price. And I think one of the things that Sajid said today was quite important. He's focusing on more brownfield building. High streets where you've had shops in the past, perhaps that's where you can infill with more flats, more houses. Places where we've not assumed you could build before, we've now got to be building houses in the future.
If I had a pound for every time politicians told me they'd build on brownfield sites, David, I may well be able to pay for the housing programme myself on this. And it seems to happen very, very slowly. Do you really think we're in for... I mean, I've followed this. The Blair government's record on housing starts was pretty poor, given the state of the economy. The Brown record was pretty poor as well. This government's record is actually in many ways so far worse than pretty poor. Are we ever? I mean, look, most of the demand for new homes is biggest in those areas that are run by the Tories, by the people at this conference, and they don't want to zone their land for a lot more houses. So you're looking at the problem. That's the fundamental problem.
I would say that where we can do more is that the policy measures have tended to be on the demand side, helping young couples with the cost of a house. I think we've just got to get more built. And if you look at what the government is now proposing, it's going to be easier to build on public sector land. There's going to be more liberalisation of the planning regime, so you can build in areas that have hitherto been retail, some of those high streets which have a lot of empty shops. So I hope we will shift the focus to getting more built, not just helping people with the costs by extra allowances and subsidies.
One final issue. You heard me, we only got about a minute. Talk to David Gawker about the number of people who are in jobs but are very much the working poor. One thing that would help the working poor.
Once you're in work, making it easier to move on and move up, and using the apprentice levy to fund people to get training and devolving it to local towns and cities across the country.
So to get better skills to then move on to better...
David was right. We've achieved this thing of shifting people off unemployment into work. Sadly, too often it's low-paid work. The next thing is to help them move from low-paid jobs to better-paid jobs.
Are you enjoying being at a think tank now, rather than being in the thick of it?
Well, I was in think tanks before. I was at the Centre for Policy Studies. I'm now at Resolution Foundation, and it's fantastic. And we're trying to contribute to this public policy debate.
All right. David Willetts, thanks for joining us on this Daily Politics Conference special. That's it from us here in Birmingham after 2 hours of broadcasting. Now, I'm going to be back with highlights from today's conference, including the Chancellor's speech on BBC 2 this evening, just after Newsnight, so it'll be around 11:15. And, of course, we'll have more live coverage here from what is still a sunny Birmingham here at the Conservative Party conference as they